The last thing I expected to find on my front porch that Thursday evening was a package from the people I had spent 5 years trying to keep out of my life. I had just finished another 12-hour day reviewing quarterly reports, and all I wanted was dinner with my husband, Daniel, and enough energy to help our 6-year-old son, Liam, finish the cardboard solar system he insisted had to be perfect for school the next morning. Instead, I stepped onto the porch and froze. A plain brown package rested neatly against the front door. No shipping label, no return address, no delivery company sticker. Just my name, Rachel Bennett, written across the top in black marker. My stomach tightened before I even touched it. My parents had never mailed anything anonymously. They preferred showing up uninvited or calling from numbers I didn't recognize. This felt different. It felt planned. I looked up and down the quiet street. Nothing moved except a neighbor walking her dog at the far corner. Whoever left it knew exactly when I wouldn't be home. I picked up the package and immediately noticed how light it was. Something slid softly inside when I tilted it. Taped to the top was a white card with only 5 words written in careful handwriting. "Don't let him see this first." I read the sentence 3 times before realizing my hands were shaking him. Daniel? My father? Someone else. The message wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Every instinct I had spent years rebuilding suddenly screamed that something was terribly wrong. I carried the package inside but didn't open it. Instead, I locked the front door, checked the back door, and looked through every downstairs window like someone might be watching. That reaction embarrassed me until I remembered who had raised me. Growing up, my father had a way of making every room feel like an office where someone was always being evaluated. Every conversation had consequences. Every mistake was remembered. Even after moving out, getting married, and building a career that had nothing to do with the family business, I never completely stopped expecting him to appear whenever life felt peaceful. "Mom," Liam shouted from the living room, "can you see if Saturn looks too small?" I forced a smile before walking in. He was sitting on the floor surrounded by paint, glue sticks, and foam balls of different sizes. Daniel wasn't home yet. He had texted earlier that traffic was terrible after a truck overturned on the interstate. "It looks perfect," I said, kneeling beside Liam. "Maybe make the rings a little wider." He grinned and went back to work without another question. Children have an incredible ability to accept the world exactly as it appears. I wished adults could do the same. The package sat on the kitchen island, quietly pulling every ounce of my attention toward it. I tried making dinner. I burned the onions because I kept glancing at the card. "Don't let him see this first." Whoever wrote it knew Daniel, or wanted me to think they did. 20 minutes later, the garage door opened. Daniel walked in carrying his laptop bag and immediately noticed my expression. "Everything okay?" he asked. I pointed toward the package. "That was waiting outside." He looked at it, then at me. "Were you expecting something?" "No." "Did your parents send it?" I laughed once, but there wasn't anything funny about it. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." Daniel walked closer without touching it. "Want me to open it?" I looked at the card again. "It specifically says not to let you." He frowned. "That's strange." "Exactly." We stood there in silence for nearly a minute before Daniel finally said, "Whatever this is, we're opening it together." That was one of the reasons I married him. He never tried to take control away from me. He simply refused to let me face difficult things alone. I cut the tape with a kitchen knife while Daniel stood beside me. Inside was a black drive wrapped in bubble wrap, 3 photocopied financial documents, and a sealed envelope with my name typed neatly across the front. There was also a folded handwritten letter. I opened that first. "Rachel, if this package reached you, then I've waited too long. Your father believes loyalty can erase the truth. I believed him once. I was wrong. Do not sign another document he gives you, no matter what reason he offers. Your family is in danger, but not in the way you think. The proof begins on the USP. I'm sorry for my part in what happened. Harold Miles." I stared at the signature. Harold had been the chief accountant at Bennett Industrial for almost 20 years, before retiring suddenly 18 months earlier. My father always described him as a loyal employee who wanted to spend more time fishing. Now he was sending anonymous packages to my house. Daniel took the letter and read it silently. "Who's Harold?" he asked. "Dad's accountant." "Or, he was? Do you trust him? I haven't spoken to him in years." Daniel picked up the USP. "Only one way to find out. We connected it to my laptop without opening any of the documents first. The drive contained only 3 folders. One was labeled Start Here. The second said Supporting Records. The third had a password. I clicked the first folder. A video file filled the screen. Harold appeared sitting at what looked like a kitchen table. He looked older than I remembered. Much thinner, too. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the camera. He began. If you're watching this, it means I finally found the courage to do what I should have done years ago. I glanced at Daniel. Neither of us spoke. Harold took a slow breath. I worked for your father for 23 years. During most of that time, I convinced myself I was helping a good man protect the company through difficult decisions. I ignored things I shouldn't have ignored because every explanation sounded reasonable. Then I started asking questions. He paused, rubbing his forehead. Your father doesn't see people the way you do. He sees assets, risks, solutions. He believes every problem can be moved from one column to another if the paperwork is arranged correctly. I felt my chest tighten. That sounded exactly like Victor Bennett. Harold leaned closer to the camera. Rachel, you've never been protecting your family's business. The business has been hiding behind you. Daniel muttered softly. What does that mean? I wished I knew. Harold continued. If Victor asks you to sign anything after this day, don't do it. Not until you've watched every file on this drive. There is one loan in particular that you need to examine. 3 years ago. Start there. And Rachel. He stopped speaking for several seconds before looking directly into the camera. I'm sorry I stayed silent while your name became part of something you never agreed to. The video ended. Neither of us moved. Finally, Daniel asked, do you remember signing anything for your dad 3 years ago? I laughed bitterly. Probably dozens of things. Every holiday, every family dinner. He always had some tax form or banking update. He'd say, it's routine. It'll only take a second. Daniel slid the first photocopied document toward me. Maybe that's why he sent these. The top page was a commercial loan agreement. I scanned the first paragraph without understanding much of it until my eyes landed on the signature block. Borrower Rachel Bennett. My own signature stared back at me from the bottom of the page. The handwriting looked exactly like mine. The date was from almost 3 years earlier. The loan amount made my breath catch, several $1,000,000. No, I whispered. No, I never. Daniel leaned closer. Rachel? I shook my head repeatedly. I have never taken out anything like this. Could it be a copy of something else? I flipped through the remaining pages. Every initial looked like mine. Every signature resembled the ones I used at work. My pulse pounded so loudly that I barely heard Daniel calling my name. Then I noticed something even stranger. Attached to the back of the agreement was a corporate authorization listing me as the managing member of a company I had never heard of. My phone rang. The screen displayed one name. Dad. I stared at it without answering. It rang until voicemail picked up. 10 seconds later, another notification appeared. A text message. Need you to stop by the office tomorrow. Just one signature. It'll take 5 minutes. At that exact moment, another notification appeared on my laptop. A new email had arrived from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, before you meet your father, check the loan file carefully. It isn't the worst one. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my own signature on a loan I couldn't remember approving. By sunrise, I had already searched every folder in my home office for old tax returns, bank statements, and anything connected to my father's company. Nothing explained why my name appeared on documents worth millions of dollars. Daniel left early to take Liam to school, but before walking out the door, he squeezed my shoulder and said, "Promise me you won't meet your father alone." I nodded even though I hadn't decided whether I was going to meet him at all. After they left, I opened Harold's email. There was only one sentence. Search for Bennett Commercial Holdings, not Bennett Industrial. Attached was a public business registration. I expected to find my father's name listed somewhere. Instead, the registered managing member was Rachel Bennett. My address from 3 years ago appeared beneath it. I felt the room tilt slightly. I had never heard of Bennett Commercial Holdings. I clicked deeper into the state records. The company had opened several bank accounts, signed contracts, and guaranteed multiple loans. Every official record pointed back to me. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Ethan, my older brother. We hadn't spoken in almost 2 months. "Morning, Raksh," he said casually. "Dad says he needs you at the office today." "Why?" "Paperwork." "Same as always." What paperwork? There was a brief pause before he laughed. You always ask too many questions. Funny. Dad used to say I never asked enough. Ethan ignored that. Look, we've got investors coming next week. Dad just wants everything organized. Then he can email it. His voice changed immediately. Don't make this difficult. I looked back at the registration on my screen. I've started reading things before I sign them. Silence. It lasted just long enough to make me uncomfortable. Then Ethan cleared his throat. Fine. Read whatever you want. But stop acting like everyone's trying to trick you. He ended the call before I could answer. That conversation stayed with me because it sounded rehearsed. Ethan wasn't naturally manipulative. He preferred avoiding conflict whenever possible. If he sounded like our father, it usually meant he'd been listening to Victor for hours. Around 10 that morning, I drove to the county records office. I wanted originals, not copies from the internet. The clerk printed every filing connected to Bennett Commercial Holdings. There were far more than I expected: articles of organization, annual reports, banking authorizations, equipment financing agreements. Most of them carried my name. Several contained signatures that looked almost identical to mine. Others were obviously digital copies pasted onto different pages. My stomach tightened with every document. Everything okay? The clerk asked kindly after noticing my expression. Honestly, I admitted. I'm not sure. Back in my car, I called Grace Holloway, an attorney a coworker had recommended months earlier after helping another employee through an identity theft issue. She answered on the second ring. Holloway Legal. My name is Rachel Bennett. I think someone may have been using my identity for business loans. Do you have copies? Yes. Can you come this afternoon? Absolutely. Bring everything. Don't sign anything before we meet. Her last sentence landed harder than she realized. Don't sign anything. Harold had said the same thing. Grace had never met Harold, yet somehow both of them were warning me about exactly the same danger. Before heading to her office, I couldn't stop thinking about the countless times my father had slid papers across the dining room table during holiday dinners. Routine update, bank requirement, insurance renewal. He always made signing feel like helping the family. If I hesitated, my mother would smile gently and say, "Your father has enough stress already." Then Ethan would joke that I was wasting everyone's dessert. Eventually, I'd sign just to end the conversation. Looking back, I couldn't remember reading more than the first page of anything. At 11:30, my mother called. I almost ignored it but answered anyway. Rachel, she said warmly, as if nothing unusual had happened. Your father told me you're coming by today. Actually, I'm busy. Sweetheart, he's under so much pressure. Investors are nervous. Then maybe he should tell them the truth. She laughed softly. What truth? I realized immediately that I'd revealed too much. Nothing. Rachel. Her voice lowered. You've always had such an active imagination. Don't let someone confuse you. There it was. The sentence she'd used since I was a teenager. Whenever something didn't make sense, the problem was never the facts. It was my imagination. Mom, I said quietly, have I ever owned a company called Bennett Commercial Holdings? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, so it exists. Another pause. Talk to your father. He'll explain. Why can't you? Because he handles business. Was my name used? Rachel. Her tone became firmer. Families don't interrogate each other. I closed my eyes. No, families don't hide things from each other either. She ended the call without saying goodbye. By the time I reached Grace's office, I was emotionally exhausted. She spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing the documents in complete silence. Occasionally, she highlighted sections or made handwritten notes. Finally, she leaned back and folded her arms. How much do you know about your father's business structure? Almost nothing. Did you ever agree to become an officer or owner of another company? Never. She turned one document toward me. This signature here. Is it yours? It looks like mine. Did you sign this page? I honestly don't know anymore. Grace nodded thoughtfully. Some signatures appear authentic, others appear copied. We'd need a forensic examiner to know for certain. She tapped another page. But this concerns me more. What? Every major obligation eventually points back to you. Meaning if these businesses fail, someone may argue you're personally responsible. My mouth went dry. You're saying my father built all of this around my name. I'm saying that's one possibility. She paused before continuing carefully. Rachel, I don't want to scare you unnecessarily, But if someone intentionally structured transactions this way, then they weren't protecting you. I thought about Harold's video. The business has been hiding behind you. Grace continued sorting papers until she suddenly stopped. What's this? She held up one page I'd barely noticed. It was an internal authorization signed 18 months earlier. The approving officer wasn't Victor Bennett, Ethan, my brother. I whispered. He approved transferring several guarantees. To me, Grace nodded slowly. That's what it appears. My chest tightened with a different kind of pain. Maybe Ethan hadn't simply trusted our father. Maybe he'd helped him. Grace looked at me carefully. I'm not saying he understood what he was signing, but his name is definitely here. I left her office carrying copies of everything she'd marked. As I reached my car, another email notification appeared from Harold. There was no greeting this time, only a scanned photograph of an old conference room with several binders stacked neatly across a table. One binder had a handwritten label that read Rachel, Originals. Beneath the picture, Harold had typed just 8 words. Your father keeps everything in his private office. By the time I pulled into my driveway that evening, I had convinced myself of 2 things. First, I wasn't going to let fear make my decisions. Second, I wasn't going to tell my father what I knew until I understood everything myself. My father had never been patient when someone stopped following his script. I hadn't even taken my purse inside when another text from him appeared on my phone. Tomorrow, 6 o'clock. Family dinner. Everyone will be there. We need to settle this. There wasn't a question anywhere in the message. There never was. Growing up, invitations from Victor Bennett always sounded like instructions. For years I confused that with leadership. Now it simply felt like control. Daniel read the message over my shoulder while Liam colored dinosaurs at the kitchen table. You don't have to go, he said. I think I do. Why? Because if I don't, he'll know something changed. Daniel thought for a moment before nodding. Then we go together? I smiled faintly. You know he'll hate that. That's exactly why I'm coming. I slept a little better that night, mostly because my fear had started turning into anger. Every memory I replayed looked different now. Every favor my father had asked, every form he hurried me through, every conversation where my mother insisted I was overthinking things, it all fit together too neatly. The following evening, Daniel and I drove to my parents' house just before 6. It looked exactly as it always had. Perfect lawn, fresh flowers by the entrance, lights glowing warmly through the front windows. Anyone driving past would assume it belonged to the happiest family in town. Appearances had always been my father's favorite investment. My mother opened the door before we knocked. Rachel, she said with a practiced smile. Daniel, come in. She hugged Daniel first, which immediately told me something was wrong. She only did that when she wanted him on her side. The dining room was already full. Ethan sat beside his wife, Melissa. My Aunt Olivia was pouring iced tea while 2 older cousins talked quietly near the fireplace. My father stood at the head of the table wearing the same calm expression he used in business meetings. There she is, he said. Now we can begin. No one asked how I was doing. No one asked why I had seemed upset over the phone. The evening had an agenda, and I already knew I wasn't the one who had written it. Dinner moved quickly, almost mechanically. People talked about sports, vacations, and the weather while my father barely touched his food. He kept glancing toward a black leather folder resting beside his chair. About 30 minutes later, he set his fork down. Let's handle the paperwork before dessert, he said. My stomach tightened. He opened the folder and slid several pages toward me. One of our lenders updated a compliance requirement. It's routine. I didn't reach for the papers. Can I read them? The room became unusually quiet. My father blinked once. Well, of course. All of them. Rachel, my mother said gently. It's nothing complicated. I looked at her. Then reading it shouldn't be a problem. My father gave a small laugh, as though I had made an amusing joke. You've never needed to spend an hour reviewing family documents before. Maybe that was my mistake. Ethan leaned forward. Seriously. Dad's trying to keep the business running. Then why is my name on companies I've never heard of? The silence that followed felt heavier than anything anyone had said all evening. My mother's smile disappeared first. Then Ethan looked toward our father. Victor remained completely still. Finally, he folded his hands together. Where did you hear that name? Exactly the same question my mother had asked. So it exists, I answered quietly. He studied me for several seconds before replying. Rachel, there are legal structures you wouldn't understand without context. Betray me? This isn't the place. You made it the place. My father sighed, looking almost disappointed. You've always had a habit of assuming the worst. Daniel finally spoke. She's asking a reasonable question. Victor turned toward him with the polite smile he reserved for people he wanted to dismiss without appearing rude. Daniel. Business matters stay within the business. Daniel didn't back down. Rachel is apparently part of that business. Ethan shook his head. Can we stop pretending there's some conspiracy? I looked directly at him. Did you approve transferring guarantees into my name? His face changed instantly, not guilt, confusion. What are you talking about? Your signature is on the authorization. He frowned. Dad, for the first time that evening, Victor answered before Ethan could continue. Administrative paperwork. Administrative. I repeated. For companies I didn't even know existed. Victor leaned back calmly. Rachel, when your grandfather died, we reorganized certain assets for tax purposes. Who'sing my identity? Who'sing family resources? That's not the same thing. My mother reached across the table. Sweetheart, no one is trying to hurt you. I almost laughed. Then why didn't anyone tell me? She looked toward Victor instead of answering. That tiny movement told me everything. She already knew. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Rachel, you're blowing this out of proportion. Am I? I pulled one of Grace's photocopies from my purse and laid it on the table. Then explain this. Victor didn't even glance at it. Ethan picked it up first. I watched his eyes move across the page until they stopped near the signature block. Dad, he said quietly. What is this? Victor's voice remained perfectly steady. Confidential internal documentation. Ethan looked genuinely confused. Why is Rachel listed as managing member? Because that's how the holding structure works. Since when? Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Since I decided it worked best. My Aunt Olivia finally spoke for the first time. I didn't know Rachel was involved either. Because you didn't need to know, he answered without looking at her. I realized then that this wasn't only about me. My father expected complete trust from everyone around him while offering almost no information in return. That arrangement had worked for decades because no one challenged him. Until now. I slid the remaining pages back into my purse. I'm not signing anything tonight. My father looked directly into my eyes. Rachel, refusing to cooperate could create serious problems for everyone. Maybe those problems shouldn't have my name on them. His patience cracked for the first time. Everything I've done has been for this family. Then why was I never allowed to know about it? Because leadership requires difficult decisions. No. I answered quietly. Leadership requires honesty. Ethan pushed his chair back. Can somebody just explain what's happening? My father stood slowly. Later. No, I said. Now. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since I was 17 and refused to turn down a college scholarship interview. Calm disappointment mixed with unmistakable authority. Rachel, if you choose not to support this family tonight, don't expect this family to protect you when consequences arrive. The words hung in the air long after he finished speaking. My mother lowered her eyes. Olivia looked uncomfortable. Ethan stared at our father, then at me, clearly unsure which version of reality he believed. Daniel reached for my hand beneath the table. I stood up. Let's go. No one tried to stop us. We had almost reached the front door when my father spoke one last time. You'll come back, he said confidently. You always do. I turned toward him. Not this time. We drove home mostly in silence. Halfway there my phone vibrated. Another email from Harold. Attached was a password. Beneath it he had written a single sentence. It's time to open the third folder. The password Harold sent unlocked far more than a folder. It unlocked the first honest explanation anyone had ever given me about my own family. Daniel sat beside me at the dining room table after Liam had gone to bed, and together we opened the third folder on the US drive. Unlike the first two folders, this one wasn't organized by dates. It contained recordings, spreadsheets, scanned notebooks, and a document simply titled, Read This Last. Harold had arranged everything like someone who knew he might never get another chance to explain himself. Let's start with the recordings, Daniel suggested. I clicked the first audio file. Harold's voice filled the room. If you've reached this folder, then Victor has already tried to pressure you into signing another document. That means we're almost out of time. My pulse quickened. Rachel, I spent years believing I was helping protect a family business. I wasn't. I was helping one man build an escape route. He paused before continuing. Every time Bennett Industrial faced a financial risk, Victor created another company. Every time a company carried too much debt, he shifted assets again. On paper, everything looked legal because each step was documented, but eventually every path led to one person. Daniel whispered, "You." Harold answered as though he had heard him. "You." I opened the first spreadsheet. It looked overwhelming at first, but after Grace had explained the basics that afternoon, I started recognizing patterns. Money moved from one company to another. Loans were refinanced. Equipment changed ownership several times without physically moving anywhere. Every complicated transaction eventually ended with Bennett Commercial Holdings accepting responsibility. The company that officially belonged to me. I leaned back in my chair. This wasn't random. Daniel nodded. It couldn't have been. Another file contained copies of internal emails. Most were ordinary accounting discussions until I reached one exchange between Harold and my father from nearly 4 years earlier. Harold had written, "Rachel should be informed before this transfer is completed." Victor's reply was only one sentence. "She signs what she's given because she trusts family. Don't complicate it." I read it twice before closing my eyes. Somehow that single sentence hurt more than discovering the loans. It wasn't just that my father had used my trust. He had counted on it. Daniel quietly reached for my hand. "I'm sorry." "No," I said softly. "I'm angry." It was the first time I had admitted that out loud. For years, every disagreement with my parents ended with me feeling guilty. Now the guilt had finally started turning into something healthier. Anger meant I understood I hadn't deserved any of this. The next recording was different. Instead of Harold speaking alone, several voices could be heard around what sounded like a conference table. Someone was discussing year-end reports. Another person mentioned upcoming audits. Then my father's unmistakable voice cut through the conversation. "Rachel won't ask questions. She never does." No one challenged him. Someone laughed quietly before the meeting continued. I stopped the recording halfway through. "I can't listen to any more tonight." Daniel nodded immediately. "Then don't." We sat in silence until another memory surfaced unexpectedly. I was 24 again, visiting my parents one Sunday afternoon. Dad had called me into his office while everyone else watched football. He smiled, handed me 3 forms, and said the bank had changed some procedures. I signed them standing beside his desk, because Mom was already calling everyone for dinner. When I joked that I should start charging him for my signature, he laughed and said, "One day you'll thank me for taking care of everything." At the time it had sounded comforting. Now it sounded like a confession. The following morning Grace called before I left for work. "I spent half the night reviewing the files you brought me," she said. "I think Harold was right." "About what?" "Your father wasn't just protecting himself. He was preparing a legal firewall." "Meaning?" "If enough companies failed at the same time, someone would eventually be blamed." I already knew the answer before she said it. Me, potentially. She hesitated. "Rachel, I'd like you to meet Harold." I blinked. "Who's willing?" Hugh's frightened. "But yes." "When?" "This afternoon." Harold chose a quiet diner nearly an hour outside town. When Daniel and I arrived, he was already sitting in the back corner wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. He looked even older than he had in the videos. There was an oxygen tank beside his chair. As soon as we sat down, he apologized. "I should have come to you years ago." "Why didn't you?" I asked. He looked out the window for several seconds before answering. "Cowardice wears a lot of respectable disguises." Neither Daniel nor I interrupted. Harold continued. "At first I believed Victor's explanations. Then I convinced myself nothing illegal was happening because every document had signatures. By the time I understood the full picture, I had spent almost 2 decades helping create it." "Did my father forge my signature?" I asked. Harold shook his head slowly. "Sometimes." My stomach tightened. "Sometimes." "Other times." He looked directly at me. "He had you sign documents without telling you what they really were." I thought back to birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings interrupted by folders placed beside my plate. "Sign this before dessert." "Initial here." "The bank needs one more page." Harold nodded as though reading my thoughts. Victor believed people don't question paperwork when it comes from someone they trust. Daniel asked quietly, "Why send the package now?" Harold sighed deeply. "Because your father is running out of options." He reached into his briefcase and placed a worn leather notebook on the table. Auditors have been asking questions for months. Investors are demanding new financing. Victor can't complete the next restructuring without Rachel signing one final authorization. The papers he tried giving me at dinner. Exactly. Harold pushed the notebook toward me. Everything I couldn't fit on the USB is in here. I opened it carefully. Every page contained handwritten notes, dates, account numbers, names of shell companies, arrows connecting transactions. Harold had documented everything. Why keep this? I asked. His eyes filled with regret. Because I always knew I'd need to choose between protecting my career and protecting the truth. He smiled sadly. I just wish I'd made the right choice sooner. As we prepared to leave, Harold stopped me. There's something else you need to know. I turned back. Your brother doesn't understand what your father has built. He defended him. Because Ethan only sees the front of the machine. Harold folded his hands together. Victor never trusted anyone completely. Not even Ethan. What do you mean? I found draft agreements 6 months ago. He looked directly into my eyes. If your name became unusable, the next restructuring shifted almost everything to Ethan. I stared at him in disbelief. You're saying, Rachel. Harold interrupted gently. Your brother isn't the architect. He paused. He's the backup plan. The drive home felt strangely quiet. My anger toward Ethan had softened into confusion. Had he really spent years believing he was helping our father? Or had he simply never looked closely enough to notice what was happening? That evening, Grace called again after reviewing Harold's notebook. Rachel, she said, there's enough here to begin protecting you legally. Then let's do it. We will. She took a slow breath before continuing. But there's one more thing. What? Your father scheduled a meeting with the company's largest investors tomorrow morning. So, according to Harold's notes, she paused. That's where he intends to finalize the last set of documents. And if I don't sign? Grace's answer came quietly. Then he'll probably activate the backup plan. I spent the entire night thinking about one sentence Harold had whispered across that diner table. Your brother isn't the architect, he's the backup plan. It changed everything. Until then, I had pictured Ethan as another version of our father, someone willing to sacrifice anyone for the family business. But if Harold was telling the truth, Ethan wasn't standing beside the trap. He was standing in front of another one without realizing it. That didn't erase the years he had defended our father or the pressure he had helped place on me. It only made me understand how deeply Victor Bennett controlled everyone around him. He never needed people to lie for him if he could keep them believing the lie themselves. The next morning, Grace asked Daniel and me to meet her before anyone went near my father's office. She had already contacted a forensic accountant she trusted and arranged a confidential meeting with 2 minority shareholders Harold believed had started questioning Victor's financial reports months earlier. We met in a small conference room above a title company downtown. Nothing about the place suggested that decisions capable of destroying a decades-old family business would be made there. Grace spread copies of Harold's notebook across the table beside enlarged flowcharts prepared overnight. I've verified enough public records to confirm the structure, she said. Not every transaction is illegal. That's what makes this so dangerous. Daniel studied the charts. Explain it like we're not accountants. Grace smiled faintly. Imagine a row of dominoes. Victor spent years arranging them so that if the first one fell, the last one would land on Rachel. She pointed toward a cluster of companies connected by arrows. Most businesses here guaranteed loans for each other. On paper, it looked like diversification. In reality, it concentrated liability. I looked at my own name highlighted in yellow at the center of the page. Earn the last document. Grace slid another sheet toward me. This authorization transfers operational responsibility to Bennett Commercial Holdings? My company? Legally, yes? My stomach tightened. If I signed, you'd make it much easier for someone to argue you knowingly accepted responsibility. Daniel exhaled slowly. So refusing to sign is enough. Grace shook her head. No. Refusing protects Rachel today. It doesn't erase what's already been done. She looked directly at me. That's why we need Victor to reveal his intentions himself. How? By believing you're finally giving him what he wants. I frowned. You want me to pretend I've changed my mind? Exactly. Every instinct told me confronting my father openly would end badly. But pretending to cooperate felt almost worse. Grace seemed to read my hesitation. Rachel, you're not lying about facts. You're giving him room to make decisions based on assumptions he already holds. He assumes I'll eventually obey him, I said quietly. Yes, Daniel squeezed my hand. Then let him keep believing that. Around noon, I received another message from my father. Conference room, 3 o'clock. Investors will be present. Don't be late. No greeting, no explanation, just another command. I replied with only 2 words. I'll come. Less than 30 seconds later, he answered. Good choice. Grace looked over my shoulder and smiled slightly. He thinks the pressure worked. It usually did. Not anymore. Before leaving, Harold called unexpectedly. His breathing sounded heavier than before. Recha, one more thing. I'm listening. Victor keeps duplicate records. Where? His office safe. Do you know the combination? Harold gave a tired laugh. No. But I know something better. What? He always opens it before meetings with investors. Why? Because he likes reminding himself he controls every piece on the board. He coughed for several seconds before continuing. Watch who carries the black portfolio when the meeting ends. Ho. Never Victor? Then who? You'll see. The call disconnected before I could ask another question. Grace immediately wrote the detail into her notebook. Interesting? She murmured. If someone else carries it, that person probably doesn't even realize what they're holding. At 2:30 Daniel and I parked across the street from Bennett Industrial Headquarters. The building looked exactly as it had throughout my childhood. The polished glass entrance. The company logo my grandfather designed decades earlier. I used to feel proud whenever I saw it. Today it felt like looking at a carefully maintained stage set. Grace wasn't coming inside with me. That had been deliberate. Instead, she and the forensic accountant were meeting 2 minority shareholders in another office nearby. They already possessed copies of Harold's evidence. They only needed confirmation that Victor intended to complete the final transfer that afternoon. Remember? Grace reminded me before I stepped out of the car. Don't argue. Let him explain. Hard if he doesn't. People who believe they're winning usually talk more than they should. I walked through the lobby alone. Several longtime employees smiled politely as I passed. Most of them had known me since I was a teenager spending summer breaks filing invoices upstairs. None of them knew I might already be legally connected to businesses they had never heard of. My father was waiting in the executive conference room with Ethan and 3 investors I recognized from company holiday parties. Victor stood immediately when I entered. There you are? He said warmly, as though nothing unpleasant had happened at dinner 2 nights earlier. I'm glad you reconsidered. I said I'd come. Sometimes that's enough. Ethan looked relieved to see me. I told Dad we'd work this out. I forced a small smile but said nothing. One of the investors introduced himself again even though we'd met several times before. Another complimented my financial career. The conversation remained comfortably superficial until everyone sat down. Then Victor opened his black leather portfolio, the same one from family dinner. He removed several folders and distributed them around the table. Finally, he placed a single document in front of me. This, he said confidently, is simply an updated operational authorization. I didn't touch it. Can you explain what it does? Victor smiled. It keeps unnecessary liability away from the main company. By moving it where? To the appropriate entity. Which is? He folded his hands together. Herschel, we don't need to burden everyone with technical language. One investor laughed politely. Counting paperwork usually isn't exciting. Victor nodded. Exactly. I looked directly at him. Whom or me? For the first time that afternoon, annoyance flickered across his face. It vanished almost instantly. Bennett Commercial Holdings assumes responsibility for certain financing arrangements. The company under my name. One investor looked toward Victor. Another adjusted his glasses. My father answered without hesitation. Temporarily. Who decided that? I did, without telling me, because it protected the family. I let several seconds pass before asking my next question. Protected who? The room became very quiet. Victor leaned forward. Enough. No. I replied calmly. I really want to understand. Ethan looked back and forth between us. Dad. Victor ignored him completely. Sign the authorization. Instead of reaching for the pen, I reached into my bag. Everyone at the table watched as I removed a thick envelope and placed it gently beside the unsigned document. Victor frowned. What's that? I met his eyes. Something I think everyone here deserves to see before anyone signs another page. For a moment nobody said a word. My father's eyes stayed on the envelope while the investors looked from him to me, trying to understand why an ordinary authorization meeting had suddenly become something else. Victor recovered first. He smiled politely and folded his hands together as though indulging an emotional daughter. "Rachel," he said, "this isn't the time." "Harkshally," I replied, "I think this is exactly the time." I slid the envelope across the polished conference table until it stopped in front of him. "Go ahead." He didn't touch it. "What's inside?" "Copies." "Of what?" "The same records your former chief accountant thought everyone should see." His smile disappeared. Ethan frowned. "Former chief accountant." One of the investors leaned back in his chair. "Victor, is there a problem here?" My father answered without looking away from me. "No problem at all. Rachel has unfortunately been given misleading information by someone with a personal grudge." I had expected that response. It sounded almost identical to the explanations he had used throughout my childhood whenever anyone questioned him. There was always another person's bad attitude to blame, never his own decisions. "Then open the envelope," I said quietly. "If it's misleading, everyone here deserves to know why." Victor still didn't move. The silence became uncomfortable enough that one investor finally reached toward the envelope himself. "Perhaps we should all understand what's happening before any documents are signed." My father placed his hand over the envelope before the man could touch it. "Internal family matters don't belong in this meeting." "They do," I answered. "If my identity has been used to support the financing you're discussing." That sentence landed exactly the way Grace predicted it would. Every person at the table looked directly at Victor. Ethan blinked several times. He said carefully, "What does she mean?" Victor sighed dramatically, as though exhausted by unnecessary drama. "Rachel has become confused about our corporate structure." "No," I said. "I've become informed." Before he could interrupt again, I removed another document from my bag. It was a copy of the state registration listing Bennett Commercial Holdings under my name. I placed it beside the authorization waiting for my signature. I never agreed to own this company. One investor adjusted his glasses and read the page. "Victor?" My father answered calmly. "Rachel agreed years ago." "Show me where?" I replied. "Show me one document where anyone explained what I was signing." He didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward Ethan. "Would you please explain to your sister that restructuring isn't unusual?" Ethan looked down at the registration, then back at me. "Raksh, I honestly thought you knew." My heart sank. Harold had been right. Ethan wasn't pretending. He genuinely believed I had agreed to everything. "Did you?" I asked him softly. "No." "No. Then why did you sign the transfer authorization?" He looked confused. "Dad told me accounting needed updated approvals because of tax changes." I nodded slowly. "Did you read every page?" He hesitated. That hesitation answered the question before he spoke. "Not every page." Victor immediately stepped in. "Enough?" His voice was sharper now. "We're wasting everyone's afternoon." One of the older investors folded his copy of the authorization and placed it on the table. "Victor, I don't consider questions about ownership a waste of time." Another investor agreed. "Neither do I." My father looked around the room and realized the balance had shifted slightly. He forced another smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, Rachel has unfortunately been manipulated by someone seeking revenge after leaving the company." I reached into my bag again and removed Harold's handwritten notebook. "You mean Harold?" Victor's expression froze for barely a second before returning to normal. "Harold has been ill." "Yes." I nodded. "He's also documented almost 15 years of financial decisions." Ethan stared at the notebook. "Dad, why would Harold do that?" Victor didn't answer him. Instead, he looked directly at me. "You're making a mistake you'll regret." That sentence would have terrified me a week earlier. Now it only confirmed I was standing in the right place. "Maybe," I replied. "But today I'm making my own mistake instead of yours." At that exact moment, the conference room door opened. My father turned immediately, irritation flashing across his face. "We're in the middle of a private meeting." Grace stepped inside carrying a slim briefcase. Behind her walked the forensic accountant she had introduced me to that morning. Two minority shareholders followed close behind. The receptionist who had escorted them looked uncertain until one of the investors already seated at the table spoke first. "It's all right. They're here for us." Victor slowly stood. "Grace?" he said coldly. "You're not authorized to be here." "Actually," Grace replied, I was invited by shareholders representing more than enough voting interest to request clarification before additional obligations are approved. She placed her briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside were neatly organized binders, color-coded tabs, and certified copies of public filings. The forensic accountant connected a small laptop to the conference room monitor. Within seconds, a flowchart filled the screen. Colored lines connected dozens of companies. Every path eventually ended at Bennett Commercial Holdings, my company, or at least the company that officially belonged to me. One shareholder looked at the diagram and whispered, "Good Lord." Grace remained perfectly calm. Over the past 12 hours, we've compared publicly available filings with documentation voluntarily provided by a former senior employee. She nodded toward Harold's notebook without mentioning his health. Several inconsistencies require explanation before any further restructuring occurs. Victor laughed once. Inconsistencies. Corporate structures are complicated. Complicated? Grace agreed. Is not the same as undisclosed. She clicked a remote. Another image appeared. It displayed copies of signatures collected over several years. Some matched perfectly. Others contained subtle differences impossible to notice with outside, by-side comparison. Grace spoke carefully. "We're not making accusations today. We're asking why documents involving Ms. Bennett's personal liability were executed without clear evidence that their purpose had been fully disclosed to her." Ethan leaned forward, staring at the signatures. "Dad," his voice cracked slightly. "Did Rachel know about all this?" Victor answered immediately. "Of course she did." I looked directly at Ethan. "Did I?" He couldn't meet my eyes. The room stayed silent long enough for everyone to hear the air conditioner cycling overhead. Finally, Grace opened another binder. "There's one more issue." She placed a draft agreement in front of Ethan. "Mr. Bennett, have you ever seen this?" Ethan picked it up and frowned. "No, it's dated 6 months ago." He kept reading. The color drained from his face. "What?" He stopped speaking altogether. I knew exactly what he had found because Harold had shown me the previous day. The document transferred nearly every remaining guarantee from my company into Ethan's name if certain financial conditions were triggered. Grace spoke soft. "This appears to be a contingency plan." Ethan looked up at our father with genuine disbelief. "You were going to move everything onto me." Victor didn't answer immediately. He looked around the room searching for support that was no longer there. "I was precautionary planning?" "Without telling me?" Ethan asked. "It would never have become necessary." Ethan slowly lowered the papers. "You said I was taking over the business." "You are." "Or taking the blame?" Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. My father looked at Ethan the same way he had looked at me so many times over the years, disappointed that someone had stopped following instructions. "Sometimes leadership requires sacrifice," he said. Ethan gave a hollow laugh. "Whose sacrifice?" Before Victor could answer, one of the senior investors quietly closed his folder. "I think we've heard enough for today." Another stood beside him. "No one signs anything." Grace nodded once toward me. Everything we had hoped would happen was already happening. My father had walked into the room believing complete control was only one signature away. Instead, every assumption he depended on was collapsing around him, one question at a time. Then the lead investor looked directly at Victor and said the words my father never imagined hearing inside his own boardroom. "Before this meeting continues, we're ordering an independent forensic audit of every entity connected to these transactions." I used to believe there would be one perfect moment when everything my father had hidden would collapse at once. I imagined someone standing up, pointing at him, and saying they finally saw the truth. Real life wasn't like that. It happened much more quietly. It started with people who had trusted him for years choosing not to trust him for 5 more minutes. After the lead investor announced the independent forensic audit, no one reached for another document. No one mentioned the authorization waiting beside my untouched pen. The entire purpose of the meeting disappeared in a single sentence. Victor remained standing at the head of the table. But for the first time in my life, he looked like someone who wasn't completely certain he could control the next conversation. "Let's not overreact," he said evenly. "Corporate audits happen all the time." The lead investor nodded once. "They do? They usually happen before someone asks a family member to assume personal liability without a clear written explanation." Victor turned toward me. "Rachel, tell them you understood the restructuring." I met his eyes. I can't tell them something that isn't true. You signed the documents? I trusted you. The room fell silent again. My father had always relied on one assumption, that trust and consent were the same thing. Hearing the difference spoken aloud seemed to affect everyone except him. Grace calmly slid another folder toward the investors. These are dated emails showing repeated requests from Mr. Miles asking that MEMS. Bennett received full disclosure before additional obligations were transferred. One investor opened the folder immediately. Another read over his shoulder. Victor looked at Grace with open frustration. A disgruntled employee's opinion isn't evidence. No, Grace agreed. But contemporaneous records explaining why he objected certainly deserve examination. Ethan was still staring at the contingency agreement in front of him. He hadn't spoken in several minutes. Finally, he looked at our father. You told me I'd be running the company? You will. After taking responsibility for debts I never approved. Victor's jaw tightened. Those papers were preliminary. Ethan laughed bitterly. Just like Rachel's. That question hit harder than any accusation I could have made. My father didn't answer because there wasn't an answer that sounded reasonable anymore. One of the minority shareholders leaned forward. Victor, have there been other entities structured this way? Of course there have. That's how holding companies operate. Were all of them fully disclosed to the people listed as responsible? Victor hesitated. It lasted only a second, but everyone noticed. Every decision was made for the good of the business. The investor shook his head. That wasn't my question. Before Victor could respond, the conference room door opened again. This time the company's outside audit counsel entered carrying a tablet. He had apparently been contacted the moment the shareholders voted. I've been informed the board has requested immediate preservation of all financial records, he said professionally. No files are to be altered or removed until the review is complete. Victor looked genuinely offended. You think I'd destroy records? The attorney answered without emotion. Standard procedure. For years my father had used procedures to control other people. Now procedures were controlling him. I didn't enjoy watching it as much as I expected. Mostly I felt tired. The lead investor stood. Meeting adjourned. Victor raised his voice slightly. You can't suspend operations based on misunderstandings. We're not suspending operations, the investor replied. We're suspending unquestioned trust. Those words stayed with me long after the meeting ended. As everyone slowly filed toward the hallway, Ethan caught up with me near the elevator. He looked older than he had that morning. Rachel. I stopped walking. He rubbed both hands across his face before speaking again. Did you know? About what? That Dad planned to move everything to me? I shook my head. I only found out yesterday. He stared at the floor. I honestly thought you were trying to destroy the company. I was trying to protect my family. He nodded slowly. I know that now. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was honest. And after years of rehearsed conversations inside our family, honesty sounded unfamiliar enough to matter. 3 weeks later, the preliminary audit confirmed exactly what Harold had warned us about. Several corporate obligations had been routed through entities associated with my identity without adequate disclosure. Additional reviews were ordered. Outside counsel recommended that Victor step aside while the investigation continued. He refused. The board voted anyway. For the first time in 32 years, Victor Bennett walked out of his own executive office without the authority to return the next morning. News traveled quickly through our extended family. Some relatives called to ask what had happened. Others called to tell me I should have handled everything privately. One cousin actually said, "Families shouldn't embarrass each other like this." I answered the same way every time. Families shouldn't build secrets that require silence. Olivia came to my house one Saturday carrying a small photo album. She looked uncomfortable standing on my porch. "May I come in?" she asked. We sat in the kitchen while Liam played in the backyard with Daniel. Olivia placed the album on the table. "Your mother asked me to give you this years ago," she admitted. She changed her mind. Inside were photographs from my college graduation. Pictures I had never seen. Tucked into the back pocket was a folded envelope addressed to me in my grandfather's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter explained that he had left a small educational trust for me before he died because he believed I would someday return to graduate school. I looked up at Olivia. "Why didn't I ever get this?" Tears filled her eyes. "Victor said you weren't ready." I laughed quietly, though there wasn't any humor left in me. He always knew exactly when everyone else wasn't ready. Olivia reached across the table. Rachel, I'm sorry. This time the apology mattered. She wasn't asking me to forget. She wasn't defending anyone. She was simply telling the truth. Several months later, the investigation ended. Multiple financial reporting failures were formally documented. Civil claims followed. Some matters were resolved through negotiated settlements. Others continued through the courts. I won't pretend I celebrated every headline or every legal victory. Watching your own family fall apart isn't satisfying. Even when they built the collapse themselves. What brought me peace wasn't seeing my father lose authority. It was knowing he could no longer use mine without permission. Ethan eventually called and asked if we could meet. We chose a small coffee shop halfway between our homes. He looked exhausted. I kept thinking I was the favorite, he admitted quietly. You were? No. He shook his head. I was just useful longer than you were. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he smiled sadly. Harold was right. About what? Dad never trusted anyone. I nodded, not even himself. Ethan apologized then. Not only for the meeting or the documents, but for years of assuming our father was always right whenever we disagreed. I accepted his apology because it came without excuses. Trust would take longer. Some things can't be rebuilt with a single conversation. Exactly 1 year after the package appeared on my doorstep, I received an acceptance email from the graduate business program I had wanted to attend years earlier before family responsibilities always seemed to come first. Daniel hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Liam insisted we celebrate with chocolate cake because, in his words, school victories deserve frosting. We laughed harder that evening than we had in months. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive through dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrives while helping your child wash icing off the kitchen counter. Harold didn't live long enough to see everything resolved. Before he passed away, I visited him one final time. He smiled when I told him I'd been accepted into graduate school. Good, he whispered. Build something no one else gets to control. I promised him I would. The brown package still sits on the highest shelf in my home office. I never threw it away because it reminds me of something I once misunderstood. I thought opening that package endangered my family. The truth was exactly the opposite. The danger had already been there for years. Opening it simply gave me the chance to finally see it. Looking back, I don't think my father lost everything because I exposed him. He lost everything because he believed trust could be borrowed forever without honesty. I didn't destroy my family. I stopped carrying secrets that were never mine to protect. And if someone you love keeps telling you not to ask questions, maybe the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for the people who truly depend on you, is ask one more anyway. So let me ask you this, if a sealed package with only one warning appeared on your doorstep tomorrow, would you open it? Or would you walk away? A few months later, I realized something had changed in a way no court ruling could ever accomplish. I no longer checked my phone with a knot in my stomach whenever it rang. I no longer wondered whether another hidden obligation was waiting for me behind an innocent-looking document. Our home felt different, too. Liam laughed louder. Daniel smiled more often, and dinner became exactly what it was supposed to be. A place where people shared stories instead of signatures. Graduate school challenged me in ways I hadn't expected, but every assignment I completed reminded me that my future finally belonged to me. Daniel liked to joke that the only paperwork he wanted me to sign now was library forms, and every time he said it, we both laughed because we understood how much those ordinary moments were worth. Ethan and I slowly rebuilt a relationship based on honesty instead of our father's expectations. We never pretended the past hadn't happened, but we stopped allowing it to decide every conversation. Some relatives apologized. Others chose to stay distant because admitting the truth would have forced them to question years of comfortable assumptions. I accepted both reactions. Healing isn't measured by how many people come back. It's measured by how peaceful your life becomes when you stop chasing those who walked away. One afternoon, I found the brown package while organizing my office. For the first time, I opened it without fear. There was nothing inside except the empty envelope, the handwritten warning, and the USB drive that had changed everything. I framed the small card instead of throwing it away. Not because I wanted to remember the betrayal, but because I wanted to remember the moment, I finally trusted my own judgment instead of someone else's authority. My father spent years teaching me that loyalty meant silence. Life taught me something far more valuable. Real loyalty never asks you to surrender your integrity. It never demands that you ignore obvious questions or carry responsibilities that were never yours. Sometimes the strongest way to protect your family isn't by keeping their secrets. It's by refusing to let those secrets become your children's future. Looking back, the sealed package wasn't the beginning of my family's downfall. It was the beginning of my freedom. And if you've ever been told to stay quiet for the sake of family, ask yourself one question: are you protecting the people you love? Or are you only protecting the person who's been using your silence?